The Biden administration is looking to bring the United States back into UNESCO. That's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. This is despite an ongoing scandal involving the body's leadership and its decision to flout U.S. law by admitting the state of Palestine is a member state. Trump previously pulled the U.S. out when he was president, and there probably will be some challenges if the U.S. wants back in. Here to speak with us about this is Epoch Times contributor Alex Newman. Alex Newman, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Great to be here. Thanks so much, Josh.
So first off, what are some of the main roles of UNESCO, and why did the U.S. pull out of it?
Well, UNESCO is a sprawling agency. It has all kinds of different official responsibilities, and then it's veered out into all kinds of new areas. I actually wrote an article for the Epoch Times a few months ago about one of their newest focuses, which is fighting conspiracy theories and misinformation. They want teachers to start reporting students to the government. They claimed that conspiracy theories and misinformation are fueling populism and climate change, but denial, I guess, climate change denial. People don't care enough about their carbon footprint because of this stuff. So that's one of their newer areas of involvement. Traditionally, the name kind of gives it away, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So they've been kind of angling to become the global school board really since its inception. They've got the cultural focus. A lot of people are familiar with the World Heritage Sites, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites that they designate around the world. But I would say education is probably their main area of focus. They're working to standardize and globalize education. And from the start, they've been saying they're going to build peace into the minds of men, as in, we're going to educate the students to reject war and believe in kind of the UN ideal. So officially, that's what they're up to.
So why does the Biden administration want us back in? What pushed us out in the first place, and why do they want us back in?
Well, we've left twice before. Under Ronald Reagan, we left because, according to the Reagan administration, there was extremism, there was radical politicization. One of the things that was really troubling to the Reagan administration, they wanted to come up with a scheme to license journalists around the world. They've always been very hostile to free speech, to the free press, even though they claim they're protecting free speech and the free press. There was also, obviously, and this has been the case from the very beginning, massive communist influence within UNESCO, and that's true to this day. You've got multiple members of the CCP in very high-ranking senior policy-making positions there. The most recent Director General prior to the current one was an actual member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She actually served in a very senior role in the mass-murdering Bulgarian dictatorship. So those were some of the reasons why the Trump administration says we're not going to participate anymore. Spent a lot of time talking to Ambassador Kevin Moley, who oversaw this decision when he was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. He said, the anti-Israel bias was just out of control. They were taking Jewish Israeli sites and saying that they were Palestinian. They called the Israelis the occupying power in Jerusalem. So it got to be really, really extreme on that front. And, of course, they've been very hostile to fundamental American values, to our constitutional procedures, to our Declaration of Independence. And so Trump kind of seized on those things, took us out again, and now the Biden administration has, under the pretext of countering CCP influence and restoring American leadership, is what the State Department told me. They are now working to rejoin this agency, but of course they're going to need a lot of money first.
Well, I understand Republicans are trying to challenge it. Do they have a chance of blocking it? What's their argument?
Yes, that's the big breaking news. We broke that story at the Epoch Times today. My article, I believe, was published yesterday evening, if I'm not mistaken. So we broke that story. House Appropriators, House Appropriations Committee, they've got a subcommittee that deals with foreign operations, the Department of State, things like that. And they decided they were going to terminate funding for UNESCO. Now, they can easily pass a budget that terminates funding for UNESCO. The question is, what will Joe Biden do? What will the Senate do when that legislation comes before them? Obviously, all appropriations have to originate in the House of Representatives. So ultimately, the House does retain the power of the purse. If Republicans stand firm and show resolve, they can absolutely stop this process in its tracks. But we've kind of seen this play out numerous times before. The House Republican leadership says we're not going to fund this. The Democrat president says, oh, you guys are terrorists. You're shutting down the government. Soldiers aren't going to get paid because of you. And then House Republicans go back to the drawing board and cave in. So we'll see what happens with this. But as of now, House Republicans are saying that they're going to cut all funding for UNESCO. And not just UNESCO, also a variety of other UN agencies. Even the UN general budget is going to be slashed, according to House appropriators. We'll see whether they stand by that.
Well, you mentioned that the Biden administration is saying that rejoining UNESCO would help counter the influence of the CCP. Is that the case? I mean, would we be able to challenge them if we were back in it?
Well, I talked to a lot of people about this. I encourage people to read the article, and everybody that I talked to, I reached out to a lot of people. Not all of them responded, but everybody that I talked to said that's absolutely ludicrous. The only thing that would really be accomplished by this is having the U.S. taxpayer help fund the influence of the CCP. Again, the CCP has numerous operatives in senior roles within UNESCO. Even the current director general, even though she's not card-carrying communist per se, she comes from the Socialist Party. And, as we all know, socialism is, I guess, the precursor to communism. So there's this kind of ideological rigidity at the highest levels of UNESCO. And what Kevin Moley told me was not only will this not help counter CCP influence, it will actually be a major boon to the CCP. And he also pointed out that this is not true just of UNESCO. He pointed to the G77 plus China. It's a grouping of, depending on the day, 133, 134 governments. Many of them murderous dictatorships, many of them communist, many of them kleptocracies, and they kind of group together on critical issues. And when they do, obviously in a majority vote in the decision-making bodies of these organizations, they dominate, right? I mean, they have more than 2/3 of the votes wrapped up. And so the idea that the U.S. taxpayer should fund this while retaining very little influence in these organizations has really been rejected as a terrible decision by people like Ambassador Moley, by people like former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, who helped push through our exit from UNESCO. So a lot of people are very upset about this, a lot of people in Congress, a lot of people in Israel, but as best as I can tell, this is not really going to help counter CCP influence.
Alex, I know some critics argue that even if the U.S. is back in UNESCO, even if we don't do it, in fact, that UNESCO can still influence what's being done in America's classrooms. I mean, how is that possible? Is this real? Can they still influence what's taught in American schools?
UNESCO has a massive influence over what's taught in schools, not just in the United States, but around the world. One of the people I reached out to for this article was the most recent superintendent of public instruction for the state of Arizona, the top government official over the public school system in Arizona. She said even though we were out, she was the superintendent during the time after we exited. She said even though we were out, the UNESCO influence was still present in classrooms. It was still present in our textbooks, and that's going to continue with the U.S. involved, whether the U.S. government is helping to pay for this. There is a complication with the paying because U.S. law prohibits American taxpayer funding to any organization that accepts the state of Palestine as a member. But even though we're not paying, even though we're not formally members, you've got, for ideological reasons, I think, a lot of people within education circles, within what a lot of critics call the education establishment, that are very much aligned with UNESCO, that do believe that we should have kind of global standards. Some years ago, the UN even put out what they called the World Core Curriculum, and they said this needed to be taught in all the schools of the world. A few years ago, they were also boasting about how they influenced governments all over the world to adopt national testing regimes to implement national standards. They said that when they started this process, just a tiny handful of nations had national testing regimes for their education systems. By the time they had put out this proud statement, it was well over 100, very much including the United States. So they are making great deals of progress on transforming education around the world, even in the United States, where we're not officially members.
Well, for Republicans who are considering whether they should, I guess, block this, in terms of funding because they want to charge us to get back into it, what would you tell them about, maybe what they should know about this organization and how they weigh this decision?
Well, I think some of the key takeaways is that these problems have been systemic at UNESCO from the beginning, right? These problems didn't crop up when Ronald Reagan was president. These problems didn't just pop up when Donald Trump was president. These have been issues that have plagued the organization from the very beginning. In fact, if you go back and look at the very first leader of UNESCO, an individual by the name of Julian Huxley, he was the leader of the Humanist Association and the Eugenics Association. I mean, these were the racial pseudoscientists who believed some races were better than other races and we ought to selectively breed human beings, kind of like we do cattle. So you've had these issues of really problematic ideologies, really serious extremism that have plagued the leadership of UNESCO all the way back to its earliest days. And the U.S. taxpayer has traditionally funded more than anybody else the propagation of this extremism. When we left, or prior to the funding being cut off as a result of these federal laws banning funding for international organizations with State of Palestine as a member, we were funding almost 1/4 of the budget. And they expect that will continue. In fact, if we go back, part of the conditions, they're going to have a meeting about it on June 29th to see if other governments are even willing to accept the U.S. back. But if the U.S. does return, the U.S. taxpayer is expected to pay well over $500 million in so-called arrears. So this is a huge sum of taxpayer money at a time when the U.S. government is in more debt than any other entity in all of human history. And from all the people that I spoke to, I'm trying to figure out, what is the benefit that U.S. taxpayers are getting out of this. It's very difficult to find any.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Josh.